The project consists in bringing to light some hitherto unpublished material of Harold Innis. Most importantly, the history of communications manuscript that he wrote in the 1940s. But Mike is going to talk more about that. And this is already out. If you're interested, we're going to elaborate on it further. And a second volume, which I have in my hands here virtually.
Like the cover.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah. Innis in a canoe, I think.
And
yeah.
isn't it dirt research?
Yeah, dirt research, yeah. We have to get that all into the publisher by August, I think was our deadline. It should be out in about 6 months. This will contain the autobiographical memoir that Innis wrote, his MA thesis and selected correspondences, especially around the period of the First World War. This we regard, I'm going to state our contentions here unequivocally, the most important publication you require about Innis since Understanding the Media in 1951, contention number 1. Contention number 2, this is the first full-fledged, fully developed, programmatic formation of the history of communications as a discipline for serious scholarly inquiry. I'm going to try and make that argument well. The field now, of course, is expanding by leaps and bounds, whether you call it communications history, communication history, history of communications, media history, media archaeology to a degree, or even a good chunk of media ecology. It's a big field now, and this is an absolutely important pioneering text in that area. So, without further ado, I will turn the panel
Talking over to...
Yeah, to Michael. We'll talk about this, and then I'll talk about the other yet to come.
I'm going to front end and talk about what's in the first volume that we've been working on, and this has to do with the history of communication, an incomplete and unrevised manuscript that was left when Harold Innis died in 1952. So you get a sense of the timeline. Before today or yesterday or before having a drink with Paul, how many of you had ever heard of a history of communication and knew much about it other than its title?
I heard it.
What did you hear? We're just trying to figure out.
Yeah, I may have the wrong book,
Oh?
but I read a book called History of Communication, and it's probably the same one, I don't know whatever was published.
Okay. Innis did publish a couple of things that are fairly similar. He published one thing called The Bias of Communication, which was a collection of essays.
Yeah.
And then he published another book called Empire and Communications, which is basically, we'll talk sort of the front part of what's not discussed in our...
Well, the book I'm thinking of is called The History of Communication History.
So,
There are lots of those.
Yeah.
Text that's something.
So-
Yeah,
so you're all...
I wrote a book called Communications and History in 1988. That might be-
You wrote it.
Yeah, 1988. I also co-edited an introductory text
Big,
called...
thick book?
No, I don't write thick books.
Well, the good news is you're all newbies. You don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
So we can help.
I read Paul's earlier book on Innis, so
Okay.
it's described in that.
Yeah.
To some extent, and that's good. And that's, but you have the overview. But let me give you a little bit of my backstory with this whole, what's the history of communication. I did my bachelor's and master's work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And while I was there, I had the good fortune to have Jim Carey as the dean at the time. And I was working on a thesis, or a master's thesis, that was a little problematic. I was looking at the history of the campus television and radio station, as well as the activities of people like Wilbur Schramm and working during the Korean War, and what they were doing in order to try to leverage some of the communication knowledge. Welcome.
Welcome. Wow.
That's okay. And in the process, Carey gave me access to a number of other things that were in the files that they had in the Institute for Communication Research. And one of those was this microfilm copy of A History of Communications. I didn't know anything else about it, but everybody said, take it over to campus services, get a copy made. And so I then carried that around with me. I still have it today. I brought it to Ryerson a few years ago and almost left it there, so I never bring it anywhere anymore. But it was, for many people, the way they knew about a history of communications. You'd go down and look at it on microfilm. This is before the days of scanned documents, some of the other stuff did that. But I took it with me, and after I left Urbana and finished at Ohio State, I went out to teach at Princeton and Rutgers, and started to develop a bibliography of some of the things that Innis had been citing, just as a way to try to get a handle on it. And I'll show you why that was important a little bit later on. When I went to the University of Illinois as a provost, I agreed to do it for about 5 years, and the university went through a 25% budget cut. And since I was the provost in the Illinois system, I had to make the cuts. And I had hair at that time. And when it was all said and done, I came back and said, okay, I'm finished, I want to do something new. And they said, what would you like to do? And I said, well, you know, I've been carrying around this history of communications document, and I'd like to see what kind of progress I can make with it. And so they said that was good. And then that summer, they actually paid for me to go to the University of Toronto for an entire week. And I spent almost all the time in the archives going through the history of communication materials. Bottom line is, the archives are a mess. They're not very nicely organized, and you can't tell what's what, and there's like 7 copies of everything, it seems like. Somebody had a photocopy budget that didn't know what to do. But anyway, I started working on it, and I started sending emails. I had actually corresponded with Paul years and years ago when one of your first books came out, because I was teaching at Rutgers an honors course in Innis, and used some of his things before they were published. But I let the work it out, and in 2005, I met with Bill Buxton up at the University of Chicago. He was doing some work on the Rockefeller, and I had a broken ankle, and I said, this is not going to look good. That I went hard to carry my own weight. But I went in there, and Bill and I talked, and we said, okay, sounds like a good deal. He talked with Paul, and between the 3 of us, we decided we would take on the history of communication in some fashion to make it into a document of one sort or another. A little bit of background. When Innis died, he left behind lots and lots of handwritten manuscripts. Some were nicely identified, some were just...
Can somebody, you want to pass this around? Have a small group, so you can have the materiality in your hands.
And it was hard sometimes to figure out what was what. This is a sample of one of Harold Innis's handwritten pages. And one of the things that happened is that Innis's work method, if you understand this, you'll understand why the history of communications takes a little bit more time to tease out what it's about, is because he got a grant to photostat things, so he would take reading notes, photostat the reading notes, then he had these huge clippers or scissors like you'd use if you were a newspaper editor, and then had these little strips. And then he would then collect them all in the order he wanted them to, shuffle them around. So before Burroughs was doing cut and repaste, he was doing this in a physical format. And that was how he put together his first drafts. And then he would sometimes rewrite the same document again. But one of the things that happened is the original notes might have been from source A. Source A may only get mentioned 1 of the 7 or 8 times it's mentioned. So that became a bit of a problem to go forward with. But the other thing is it was all 2nd generation. So when you look at some of these handwritten notes, they're all 2nd or 3rd generation copies. The next thing they did is after Innis died, they said, what are we going to do with all of these documents? They didn't know that Buxton, Heyer, and Cheney would be taking this on. And they said, what should we do? And so they decided they were going to take the documents, particularly the history of communication, and turn it into a typescript. And so this is the first page of the history of communications. And if you look at it, you'll know that there are 2 footnotes at the bottom. And for those of you who are looking at the book as we pass it around, if you look at the first 2 pages, you'll notice there are a lot more citations there, so it needed a little bit more work to bring it to life. But it was a good kind of start place to begin. The microfilm copy was then produced and was sent all over the place, and it was a nice way for people to get a feel for what was going on. Back in the day, we used to spend a lot of time with microfilm readers. Now you hardly press to find one in a library somewhere. What was actually in that? And this gives you a feel for some of the things Innis was trying to do. When they started to put together the typescript, the first section was called Chapter 4, the coming of paper. Okay. The coming of paper had some interesting parts to it. It also had, it was 96 pages of that kind of format, back up, of the format that we just saw. And it also had 3 extra works that were included that nobody knew what they were supposed to be about. One was called Classical Literature, another one was something about in the middle of the 13th century, another one was Chaucer. But there were no clues as to where those were supposed to go into that Chapter 4. They were just all in the same folder. And what you start to realize is this might have been Innis's work method. He would do something like a piece on Chaucer that ran maybe 6 or 7 pages, type it up, and then when he was done, he'd take his big scissors, snip it up, and reassemble it and put it in with the other things he was working on. So that is one of the challenges. What do you do with those extra documents? The next chapter, Chapter 5, was printing in the 15th century. He had this little extra piece, sort of like a 6-page thing called printing in, or this 15th century sort of interesting observations and activities that were going on, just as a way to sort of round out that chapter. The next chapter was the paper and printing industries in the 16th century. It runs somewhere in the neighborhood of 121 pages. So you're looking at now probably about 400 some pages just on the top part of that, all of which heavily needed annotated and working on. Then we get to Chapter 7, paper and printing industries in the 17th century. That actually had 101 pages. That was pretty good. Chapter 8, paper and printing in the 18th century. And that actually had in the neighborhood of about 307 pages. Okay? So you're going along saying, okay, I think I got the order here. the first couple, but then we go 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. We should move right along. Well, the next file folder in the history is just paper and printing in the 19th century. No chapter, no Roman numeral, which is also important to note. Just paper and printing in the 19th century. And that ran in the neighborhood of about 160 pages. And then there were a couple others. Printing industry in Britain in the 19th century came along. That was 180 pages, and he had a couple of addendums he put in there that we don't know exactly what would be used for. And then the American printing industry in the 19th century, another somewhere in the neighborhood of about 260 pages. And some little addendums to go with it. But what this meant is you had this interesting kind of constellation of stuff. First of all, what happened to chapters 1, 2, and 3? Everybody pick that up? Okay. Secondly, why didn't we get chapter numbers since they were fairly substantial for what would have been 9, 10, and 11? And the best sort of read on what took place is Innis was working on these things, and as he got to the point where he felt it was worth sort of putting down as a rough draft of some sort, he then made it a chapter. In fact, if you look at the last three, they look more like the reading notes, and they had not been subjected to the photostating and the scissoring and the cutting and pasting and putting it all back together. The first three chapters, actually, if you buy our book, please do, you are asked your library to buy it and then read it there. You'll see we make an argument for what happened. Some people sort of naively said, well, that was something that was part of Empire and Communications, which was the first book he actually published that dealt with the history, and that's where chapters 1, 2, and 3. Well, if you go back into the archives, you'll see that that's not exactly the case, and there's some overlap, but in fact, in some of the work we've done, we found that some of the things that are in chapter 4 actually show up in Empire and Communications, so it wasn't a clear division. And what likely would have happened is Innis, when he went back and revised chapter 4, would have probably said, well, I've already talked about that and moved into a different direction. Also, as Innis worked through his various drafts, he started to change his focus, started to get a little bit more layered approach to history. This is not just, this technology was developed, this technology was developed, these 3 books were printed in a different chapter. He had layers upon layers, and he got into social, cultural, political, historical issues that makes it for a really rich read, but it's not a fast read. In fact, we got a note from Harold Innis's daughter that she reads it, but she only reads 1 or 2 pages a night. She likes to sort of read it and digest it and go on to the next. And so I guess I'd suggest if you start to read it, you think about that nonsense. So that then became the history of communications. For the background, for our version, we did something a little bit different. We didn't take all of those 11 chapters. We, in fact, begin with a wonderful foreword by John Peters from the University of Iowa. You know him. We then have the most brilliant introduction to a book you've ever read by Buxton, Cheney, and Heyer. And then we have chapters 1, 2, and 3. We basically took the old chapters 4, 5, and 6, and made them chapters 1, 2, and 3. Why do we do that? Nobody would know what we're talking about if we put chapter 4, they'd say, where's chapter? And we also explained in the introduction why that's not necessary. So we gave it chapters 1, 2, and 3. Those chapters actually have some minor editing. Paul is a wonderful person in picking out the whole story and then moving some parts around to make them all flow a lot better, which is what Innis would have been doing too. So we always tried to be in the Innis spirit, but that was something he worked on and did. And then there was substantial annotation and citations. Where do these things come from? One of the things that has hampered earlier efforts to try to do this is we didn't have the internet and some of the Google Scholar projects. Now, because Innis actually didn't use a book later than 1952 when he died, most of Google has a lot of these books already digitized and available for, if you put down and do a search, you'll come up with the actual title, and then you can look through it. Also, I work out of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign about half the time, and that library had every book we used for the first volume, so I was able to check it out in my library. My office had like 250 books, and it was just a way, but if we wanted to look at something and Bill or Paul said, hey, could you look at this? I could pull it out and we could look at it, so it made it work. But it took a lot of digging, a lot of transformation, and we're very happy it's out. We think it's a good start. You have 3 of the 11 chapters. There might be 2 more chapters that might come along at some point in the future, but for our purposes, we think this is a great start. It addresses something that hadn't been done for a while. Maybe the publication of this book and people reading it will have them enamored and say, maybe we ought to go back and put some more effort into trying to finish more of the history that Innis left behind us.
It was inconsistent with his citation style. It was not a marvelous job at sorting that out. There's 150 books in your office.
The other thing you need to note is back in the day, when they would publish a book, it's not like today there was one copy, one version that went everywhere. Each city, London might do a different version than Toronto, it might do a different version from Chicago or New York or somewhere else. So you'd have to get the exact year and the exact source of publication in order to make sure you had a copy the same. And sometimes they reprint it, which made it a little bit more confusing. But anyway, so that is volume 1. And at this point, we are finished with that, and we're on to our next project, volume 2.
Oh, turn it over to me. That's part of the project we're shamelessly vlogging here. We have the working title, something along the lines of Early Life and Letters, or Reflections, or something along those lines. And it contains the first extended document that Innis ever wrote, his MA thesis, The Returned Soldier, 1918, and the last thing he ever wrote, the autobiographical memoir that remained incomplete while he was on his deathbed. So, the alpha and the omega of this. Oh yeah, well, we have enough. The thesis.
This is not the whole thesis.
No, enough of it to give you a sense. The table of contents. The memoir, sadly, only goes up to 1922 when he passed on. At the period, 1922, he had just finished his publication of the history of the Canadian Pacific Railway and started his research on the fur trade. Do you have the timeline up as I just ramble through here? Now, what I want to talk about mostly is the memoir itself, with some maybe a passing mention of the thesis, and the letters, a selected sampling of the letters from around the time of the First World War will also be contained in this volume. The memoir is in effect a partial autobiography, a candid but guarded reflection on the events and circumstances that shaped his early life. And we can see in this memoir prefigured some of the interests that would later surface later: political economy, communication studies. He's not explicit on this. It's something that, we read into it with hindsight. So, it's markets, economy, this. Yeah, you could see where, he could go further in that area if he studied it formally. And then during the war, working in the field of signaling and communications, yeah, he must have sensed something there that would later gnaw at him, and he would explore more fully later. Whether or not he ever intended to publish the memoir, we don't know. If he had been able to complete it, would he have published it? Don't know. Posthumously? Don't know. Or it might have remained as a legacy to his family. We don't know. But in any case, by the good graces of Anne Innis, the daughter, she said, sure. We had numerous conversations with her, and in fact dedicated this work. And I dedicated my little biography of Innis to her as well. She's been absolutely marvelous in inspiring us and supporting us in terms of this project and the other work we've been doing on Innis. The memoir is, needless to say, more lucid than Innis's other writings. Not a page-turner, perhaps, but once you start reading, you want to sort of see where the next direction in his life might lead. That he would want to write such a document may come as a surprise, given the Innises that we know and love and sometimes get frustrated with. The political economist, hard-nosed Staples theory, the writer of History of the Canadian Pacific Railway, his first book, his PhD thesis at Chicago, then the fur trade in Canada, usually considered his magnum opus in political economy, the cod fisheries, really hard-nosed empirical research, not without theory, but really nuts and bolts, dirt research. If you want to know the number of spikes and ties used in the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, you're going to find it in Innis. Then there's the Innis that we're more familiar with in the field of media ecology, right? The later Innis. Innis, the macro historian, looking at media in history and the influence of communication media in history, looking at history as a cyclical process. Grand theory, Innis, inspired by the work of Spengler and Toynbee, looking at the rise and fall of civilizations, and also very much, and this is a point I make that other people have not really explored, Kroeber was an influence on Innis. Alfred Kroeber, Configurations of Culture Growth. I was a graduate student in anthropology at Rutgers, and my supervisor said, Kroeber, absolutely worthless. By all means, read Kroeber for your amusement. But Innis read it for more than his amusement. I mean, he owed a real debt to Kroeber that nobody seems to pull out. So we have this Innis, these two Innises that we know about. Then there's another Innis, completely overlooked by a recent biographer of Innis who remained nameless, because he has not nice things to say about me, so I won't say who he is. And this regards Innis's work in the field of memoir and biography. Everybody overlooks this. Innis was fascinating by memoirs, autobiographies, biographies, collections of letters. He saw this as a way of glimpsing what I call history from the inside. And if you look at, like, the bias of communication, there's all these citations of memoir-type materials, which, people have sort of looked at and not really made much of. I took it seriously. I was like, well, what's going on here? He's using all this very personal series of accounts, and then he's writing his own memoir. And so I sort of started digging deeper. When I did my little, that one person there has read my little mini biography of Innis. I found, well, geez, let's look at a few of these and see what Innis was trying to do. The first one, 1930, he publishes The Fur Trade in Canada, his magnum opus of political economy. That same year, he brings out Peter Pond, Fur Trader and Adventurer, the journals of Peter Pond. And Innis writes the introduction, and he does a running commentary on Pond's journals, Pond's memoirs. And he's fascinated by Pond for a number of reasons. Pond was a key figure in the fur trade in Canada. He was a Connecticut Yankee who came up to Canada, got involved with the Northwest Company, made serious incursions into Western Canada on behalf of the fur trade, and has been completely overlooked by Canadian history. In fact, disparaged and dismissed by one of the major figures in Canadian history, Alexander Mackenzie, who claimed a lot of the things that Pond had done. So, what's going on here? One of the reasons Pond was dismissed is what we would today call an unreliable narrator. You look at his memoirs, and the spelling is, how shall I say, quite original. The grammar is virtually non-existent. That didn't trouble Innis. He thought there was something significant in this memoir. And I began to think, why is Pond writing this way? Everybody mocked him for this. My theory, he learned to be literate as an adult. He started life as an apprentice shoemaker. Don't need to be literate for that. And then he got involved in business in the fur trade. So my theory is that he learned the alphabet. Here's my tool, it's the alphabet. I'll use it whatever damn way I want to use it to express what I want to express. So he writes in a way that's absolutely charming, because you get a sense of the voice itself. Because he's writing phonetically, you get a sense of what he might have sounded like when he spoke. So Innis takes this, and he does what the anthropologists in the 19th century called the test of recurrence. So he takes accounts that Pond writes and compares them to actual historical accounts written by, established people. It's too good. Pond completely consistent with these guys. So when Pond writes about things that aren't covered in formal history, Innis concludes, Pond's probably accurate, because when we compare him to known accounts, he's accurate. So when we compare him to accounts we don't have, maybe he is a reliable narrator, although writing in a style that led to him being, dismissed by later commentators on the history of the fur trade. So that accompanies people to ignore. The recent biographer completely ignores that text, which I think is a fascinating side of Innis. He'd be fascinated by a guy who's marginal and unacknowledged by history, and yet who made some very important discoveries. Since we started this project, I should say, and one of the people who's a friend of mine, there are two biographies now. One is already complete, being written by Pond, the other one's still in the works. So Pond is now finally resurrected, but Innis was there in 1930. A decade later, 1940, Innis again edits, writes chapter introductions and a conclusion to the diary of Alexander MacPhail, a contemporary of Innis and a key figure in the cooperative movement on the Canadian prairies and the establishment of the Blue Pools. He felt a kinship with MacPhail. Both had Scottish ancestry, both had a rural upbringing, and both had served in the army in the First World War. So he was fascinated by this guy and the thing he was doing on behalf of the farmers. One of the things that comes to light when Innis is writing about MacPhail, and I just love this quote, Innis is describing MacPhail. He says, he loathed cynicism, smartness, and pomposity, admired brains, respected honesty. It was difficult for him to unbend physically or mentally, He had a strong sense of humor and a hard, agnostic bent of mind. He read widely, especially in the area of biographies. This is a complete self-portrait of himself, using MacPhail as his subject. Later decade, and that decade, 1948, he co-edits the Diary of Simeon Perkins, who was active in the latter part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century. Perkins, again, another Connecticut Yankee, enterprising people, those Connecticut Yankees, who came up to Nova Scotia and got involved in the business of timber and leather and various other goods between the Caribbean and the UK during the period of the American Revolution. This is so fascinating. Here's an American in Nova Scotia dodging American privateers to engage in training, and a very significant figure in that. So Innis and a number of other people sort of resurrect Perkins as a figure. So there's three significant biographical type studies that Innis was engaged in that fascinated him. And again, my contention is that having edited these three memoirs and read many others, and the citations are clear in his later work, Innis had a basis or an inspiration for his own foray into that when he came to his memoir. And his own memoir follows these three because it really omits as much as it reveals and doesn't deal with personal stuff. You know, it's not Rousseau's Confessions. None of these memoirs are, nor is Innis's memoir anything like that. It's more with time and place and events and so on, and it mentions their people. There's nothing about his romance and marriage to Mary Quayle. In case you're wondering about that name, yes, she is related to a notorious American politician famous for his own critique. The correspondences, on the other hand, reveal the side of Innis. And we're going to include a good smattering of the correspondences in Volume 2. So time and place are the emphasis rather than personal. Clearly, he reveals he's a son, child of the soil, not the polis. This is a rarity in academia. Very few academics made their way into the university at that point in time. One who did was the American maverick economist Thorstein Veblen from Minnesota, whom Innis greatly admired. Maybe not Veblen's lifestyle, but Veblen's work and the fact that Veblen had this hard-scrabble upbringing that Innis also had. So he was had quite a bit of admiration for Veblen. He describes the family farm in great detail, and in my biography of Innis, I visited the family farm and sort of checked out the various places that Innis writes about. Talks about the weather and the market variance. And so you see the beginnings of political economy in the memoir. Year-to-year vicissitudes of climate, production, the dependency on markets, the relationship between the center and the margins and so on, concerns that would again come later in his Staples research. Now, here's a little aside that I have to mention because, you know, I absolutely love Anne Innis Dagg. She's a marvelous person. Innis, in this memoir, is an acute observer of animal behavior, both natural and domestic. And you sense in Innis a budding Darwin, but he never formally studied science in university. But yeah, he was very curious in that way. His daughter, Anne Innis Dagg, went on to become a biologist and one of the first persons to formally study the behavior of animals in Africa in the wild. She was years ahead of Jane Goodall and has not been given credit. She's a very, very modest person. I said, "You're in the head of everybody." She said, "No, well, that's important." She said, "Well, you know, nobody thinks so." I said, "I think so." He indicates that he was a student of a lot of self-discipline. He wrote his finals with the measles. We wouldn't want to do that today. Well, his mother also had the measles, so in those days, I guess you couldn't get deferred exams or whatever. So
Some professors.
Yeah. It seemed like a career in law, and he went to McMaster University to pursue his undergraduate degree. And he had a terrible time at first, alienation, and he wanted to quit. This is not in the memoir. This is in the letters. So we have the letters published where he writes home, I don't know anybody here. You know, this is terrible. I don't like the city. I want to come home. And he goes home and he rethinks it and His mother encourages him to go back. And then second and third year, things start to fall into place. He gets on the debating team, and he's having a much better time. But the memoir doesn't tell you the agony of the first years, but the letters certainly do. Along comes World War I, and of course, young men were expected to enlist. But the university made them an offer. He said, well, if you enlist in the Army, you don't have to write your final exams to give you a degree. And he says, no, I'll enlist. I want to write my final exams. And he's a stubborn guy. So, off he goes to war, and shock came on two fronts. First, on the literal front of battle, that's to be expected. But secondly, in preparation for going into battle, he was shocked by the harsh, abusive, disrespectful treatment of colonial soldiers who were at the hands of the British officers. This, terrible. And when he comes back, this becomes part of the reason he was urging for Canada to have greater autonomy in the Empire, in the Commonwealth. Yeah, but that really, we should have been respected for going there and volunteering to do this, and yet they were mocking and insensitive. Brutality is one of the words he uses regarding the treatment of the colonial soldiers. We could have been globally illustrated, but that's another story. He served as a signaller in the artillery division of the infantry. This I find fascinating. Look at World War I. It's the first modern war, yes, but it's also a virtual history of technology and communication. So everything is used in transportation, from horses, and we have, like, cavalry, made famous by a play in a movie, of course, and horses to aircraft in transport. So you got, in communication, you've got semaphore, carrier pigeons, the radio. So you've got the whole history of communications right there during that period as we transition from the old style of warfare to the new style of warfare. And I think that impressed him considerably. He describes the immediacy of battle in detail, unemotionally and deadpan, but all the more powerful because of the way he describes it. And he knew whereof he spoke, because on July 17, 1917, at Vimy Ridge, an artillery shell exploded behind him, did serious damage to his knee. It could have been worse. He was wearing a pack-sack with books, and some of the fragments lodged in the books. And John Durham Peters, in the foreword to our Volume 1, says, saved by the materiality of the medium, but he would go on to study. Then he convalesced as a result of that, and wanted to do something on behalf of those who served in the war, and wrote his MA thesis on the returned soldier at McMaster, still thinking a career in law would be the way to go. But he thought he had to learn more about the field of political economy. So off he goes to the University of Chicago, which was quite the milieu to be a student at that time. I mean, it's sociology, and this is often mentioned, but I would also mention, having my undergraduate background in geography, American historical geography in Chicago was a big deal. There was sort of opening up all kinds of areas of inquiry. And Innis must have been influenced by that. I know you don't see it in his formal writings. And PhD. And he goes on to teach at the University of Toronto. And during the course, and this is where Bill Buxton is really great, because remember, it's all going to end in 1922. Just prior to that, Innis revisits Europe, and Bill Buxton follows Innis's revisiting pathway through Europe, and that will be part of the introduction to the second volume, to the Life and Letters. Bill, traveling that route, looking back at what Innis wrote in his letters about those travels, and commenting on the state of those particular places today. Okay, give me 1 minute. I want to say a few words about the MA thesis, the returned soldier. That's it. Oh, terrific. My first reaction to this was, my God, why wasn't this revised and made available to government agencies? And geez, it has the tone of a commissioned study. And this is concerned with not only the returned soldiers who are wounded, he is very interested in their psychological well-being, the trauma that was inflicted upon them, as a result of having served in the war. Innis looks at what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. That term was years away from, being formalized, but that's what he's looking at. And he advocates re-education. There's the Khaki College, which was a way of allowing soldiers to pursue their studies further when they come back. It already existed, and it said, look, great institution, expanded. This is important. It's got to be developed any further. He warns of the dangers of alcoholism. He advocates family counseling for the returned soldiers. Obviously, this was not considered to be of that great importance at the time. Now we would say, wow, yeah, of course, we should try and do this. But then, Innis just wrote it as a thesis. His committee passed it. And, okay, Innis is saying, well, the press, the schools, the church should all take an interest in the plight of these mostly young men who served in the war and do something on their behalf. So it's really impressive in that regard, even though it's pretty much in this mode of scissors and paste.
Yes.
It jumps from one thing to the other. Last point I want to mention is the anticipation factor. When you look at the thesis, you sense areas in which Innis would also work in later life, social policy. The fact that here was something that wasn't social policy at the time as an MA thesis, but it deals with something that would be very appropriate as social policy. Innis later comes to deal with that. And let me conclude with a take, because a number of you know that I work with the work of Ted Carpenter, who is my professor and a real champion of Innis. This is something Carpenter wrote about Innis. He personified reason, justice, and democracy. When he spoke, he seemed to speak for society. And Carpenter was comparing him with McLuhan. And what he said about McLuhan was a little less flat. What he said about Innis, I thought was quite accurate. So, Phil's turn.
Thanks, Paul.
Add to the...
One thing I'd jump in and add,
Yeah.
if you read The Returned Soldier, and this goes back a few years ago, nobody knew exactly where it was. And one of the people sitting at this table said you'd never find it.
Yeah, I told him you'd never find it.
And I found it. It was
Your son found it.
Well, he helped, yeah. My son was getting a master's degree in library science. Oh, we can find that, Dad. So he got on sort of the deep web of where books are. And so we got a copy, and I shipped it to Urbana. I made 3 photocopies and scanned it, sent it to Paul and Bill, sent it back. As we were getting ready to make sure we had everything done, I went back to ask McMaster, can you send that back again through interlibrary loan? Because they had it on the record as being there. It's not there anymore. So it's disappeared. One of the interesting things, too, since we've gotten so used to the way theses are prepared, this looks like Harold actually sat down and typed it out on a manual typewriter, and more interestingly, it's done in 2 columns.
Yeah.
The left-hand column are the section headings, and the right-hand column is the text that goes with it. So instead of having section in this, he goes left, right. And so we had to make a decision when we went to print it, what should we do, and we decided we'd put it all into the familiar 1-column format.
Rather than go through a word processor, a nightmare.
But having read a lot of Innis, when you first read this, you realize how young he was. He is really pretty critical and harsh about a lot of things in life. He was not a happy camper, I guess you would say. And that was one of the things that we felt needed to be surfaced, and the work that Bill has done with the letters also brings some of that forward too. Sort of the personal side of Innis, which I think is what pretty much defines Volume 2, that you're not likely to find in any of the other areas. So that's why we found it was worth exploring further the thesis, the letters, getting the memoir moved forward. And I'll echo Paul's comments about Innis Day.
Yeah.
She really has gone out of her way to support us. I didn't mention at the beginning, but as we had that typescript that came in the microfilm that all of us had, the people in the University of Toronto who were overseeing Innis's publication sent it off to see if somebody would publish it. And the response was no.
Yeah.
2 very, very, very critical reviews saying, no, it's not worth it, it's not what it should be. Put it into the context of what Paul said earlier, this is the first really history of communication that's done in a sort of a deep history sense and not just a superficial history sense. They didn't quite know what to do with it. Yeah, there were some technical issues, but those could have been resolved. But it, I think, shows that the Innis family felt a little gun-shy about taking anything that wasn't already published and moving it forward, because the last time they tried this, we got shot down. Paul has and Bill do have very personal relationships rather with the family. I have some as well. But as we were working on this initially, I would get a phone call like every 2 weeks. This is going to make my dad look good, right? Or they were so afraid that that hurt that was still there from those earlier reviews was going to be perpetuated in the book. So when Anne got a copy of it, she loved it. So we redeemed ourselves. We made it worth her commitment and us to make it work.
Yeah, when I first got interested in looking for the MA thesis, a student of mine went to McMaster and said it was missing. Then it turned up, you found it, now it's missing again. So.
But never
We got it printed out, yeah.
It's such a bizarre story that it can't be kept in care.
That there weren't more copies of it. It seems like almost anything from somebody of that stature would have been taken at some point and put into a rare book room or something.
Yeah. Especially such an illustrious graduate.
Yeah. Even they've got a library at McMaster named Innis Library.
That's right.
It should be framed on the wall maybe or something.
Unless you buy many copies of it.
Well, then it will be safe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's the intention.
I was just going to sort of speak following what you were saying when Innis came back from the First World War. Not only was he also really aghast at the way that the British were treating the colonial soldiers, but he was also, I think, my understanding is he went off to fight in that war, also thinking that he was fighting on the side of Christianity.
Yeah.
And,
Moral cause, he calls it in the letters.
That's right. So he's going on this moral cause when he comes back, or throughout the whole experience. I think he feels at the end that was really not true at all, and that he kind of comes back, crisis of faith, and there's a question of whether he lost, because he was quite a religious fellow when he left, and so returning, the question of whether or not he completely became an atheist or an agnostic after that point. So that was another one of the fallouts of his experience in the war. Thanks for reminding us about the memoirs, because I was, when I was reading the introduction and you were talking about that there, I completely, when I'm thinking of Innis, I've known about those before because I've read your book and maybe you discussed it there as well, but it's not the kind of thing
The other guy didn't.
I've kept in my mind, so it's nice to be reminded of that. And speaking of that other guy, we won't mention his name, but when we had the convention in Toronto last year, it was the 50th anniversary of Innis College, which we were sort of celebrating at the same time, and I'd actually invited him to participate in something to do with Innis. And as things started to progress, we were thinking about, okay, well, let's celebrate, this release in terms of Innis scholarship. And unfortunately, he, after first, agreeing to come, he declined afterwards. And in doing that, he reminded me of the controversy, because I'd forgotten from his book, his critiques and whatnot of the idea of the history of communications, manuscript, etc. And so that was unfortunate that we didn't get him to come.
I should mention that the great biography of Innis yet to come, Bill Buxton. I mean, this would be the definitive beyond and end all. Buxton's been working in this longer than any of us, and this is going to be masterful when it does come out.
Do we know when or around when it might come?
Bill is low.
Yeah.
I don't know. And he's not, he won't say.
Yeah.
But he's just leaves no stone unturned. Not until he finds the last letter, wherever it's tucked away in some archive somewhere. So we're going to have a wait.
He's too busy a fellow, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I just maybe raised the question about, because there was this question about whether the history of communications came after Empire and Communications or came before. Both yourselves and Watson, who wrote this memoir. Okay. But we should at least fill it in.
Just a little aside, his memoir, or his biography of Innis, is not much more than what he did for his PhD dissertation back like 30 years earlier. So there was not a lot of new scholarship that went into it. It was almost like we got to get something out to celebrate it, so we'll put all that into text form and add a couple of things here and take a couple of shots at Bill and Paul, and then publish it.
And as you point out in the introduction, he doesn't ever refer to the previous versions of this manuscript. Can you tell us a little bit about how these previous versions were there, and how, when you approached the archives, okay, well, how do we look at these? And I mean, did you look? You must have, I presume, looked at all these and said, okay, they're clearly earlier versions, and so do we need to do anything with those, with what you
We don't know the
produced?
exact dates, that's the problem. Somehow between 45 and 50, they're not dated, so it's hard to know what came before which, you know.
But in all of the material that would have been in Empire and Communication, or that is not in history as it was transcribed, was actually in handwritten notes. And so you'd go through and you'd think, well, if this is this folder and this is this folder, they're consecutive numbers, it should be different. But we ended up, no real order. And so what I ended up doing is, on the table in the archive, laying out all of the pages for all the tables of contents that he had prepared, and trying to do this massive restructuring. What came first, what came second, what came third. And as we point out in the introduction, there was a dramatic shift in what Innis tried to do. The first draft, if you will, of what became Empire and Communication focused largely on technologies and media. The revisions focused on civilizations, state nations, or various things like that. You look at the titles and you get that as well. So that's part of the change that Innis was going through, which means as you approach the remaining stuff, you've got to realize this was a work in progress. And so while you try to freeze it in time and try to clean it up a little bit, you've got to realize it was still something that was ongoing, which is why I think all of us would say the chapters that don't even have any numbers should never, ever be considered being published, because they're just rough reading notes, and that's not worth asking people to try to figure out what makes sense of. But for the other question, we try in the introduction to explain how these various parts work through, and how we went from 4 chapters to 6 chapters to 5 chapters. And if you do textual analysis in Empire Communication and do a comparison, and we have both digitized, you can match them up and you can see that there's stuff in the history manuscript that matches up with what was in Empire Communication sources. So there was some overlap, and as I suspect, as he would have moved through, he would have jettisoned some of that, included new material, and those partial chapters that are in the book as well, or in the collection rather, would have also been added at various points.
We're absolutely certain that he was working toward someday publishing this. I mean, huge passages are quite coherent. And some are rough, but certainly you can see a direction, a trajectory there that would lead to him having well enough in time actually bringing this out himself.
And when you look at the quantity of the work, all the 200 pages for this section, I mean, that's a lot of work to just be not doing anything. It's kind of hard to believe that he didn't want to make use of it, and especially as something that was or actually, I wouldn't say that this was relearned by me, because I think that I learned it from your preface and talking about that. Yeah, this was the first effort at a history of communications, and therefore it has, I think, special importance for that.
First use of that term, as far as I can find. I mean, communications in history has been looked at by writers going back to the 18th century, but nobody's pulled it out and framed it as a field for serious scholarly inquiry. Innis was the first to do that. And one of the things that we forgot to mention, this anticipates Elizabeth Eisenstein, the printing presses. You look at Innis, they're using some of the same sources. Federal Martin, the coming of the book. Oh, geez, yeah, that's in Innis. McClone, Gutenberg Galaxy. But there we are, Innis talking about print in the 15th, 16th century. And I had a long talk with Robert Logan about it, and he said, McClone probably was not aware of this manuscript, so it was kind of reinventing the wheel when McClone went into that, to McClone's credit. But the fact is, some of the stuff now that we regard as major work in that area, we can see it anticipated and developed in Innis's history of communications. That's why we're waving this book around and championing the cause. Yeah. I mean, this is a big field now, and here is the foundation work.
And one of the things that's interesting as you get into the later chapters, the heavy use he makes of biographies of famous publishers and newspaper editors, just so that early interest in memoir carries over as he starts to figure out how to research this area. And let's face it, he didn't quite know what he was doing as he started off on this venture. He wanted to do a history of communication, sort of the lineages. He maybe wanted to look at newsprint, and then suddenly he realizes newsprint has materiality, but also symbolic opportunities.
I have a graduate student that's totally into media archaeology, right? Big hot field now. I said, take a look at this. He's, wow. Yeah. But the media archaeologists are not aware of this. I mean, some of them are aware of McClone, but that's about it.
I know you talk about it in the introduction, and unless I was out for a second, I'm not sure if you talked about what you had thought was coming prior to chapter 4, 5, and 6. How far was Innis going back or wanting, aspiring, because I think you say something about it in the introduction, maybe what you were thinking, he might be thinking in terms of the overall goal of what might have been in chapter 1, 2, and 3.
Stone claim papyrus. You see that in that part of communications. It's not fully developed, but he had enough of it to sketch out Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Roman Empire in part of communications. Sketchy, probably would have gone into that a little more thoroughly. And I think he had it on his mind. Given his correspondence with the archaeologist Gordon Child, I think it was on his mind to go further in that direction.
Also in his history, he tends to juxtapose things. So he'll look at China for a while, then he'll jump over to medieval Europe. And just that going back and forth, showing how some places where they developed printing and paper didn't really take it off as quickly as they did in other parts of the world. And that, I think, is one of the great insights, is you sort of get this back and forth juxtaposition of things that makes you really think a little bit more about what's going on.
I was just, a number of the things that when I was reading through this, whether they were things I already knew and forgot, or whether I was learning them for the first time, but just to give you some examples of some of the kind of interesting tidbits that you'll encounter when you look through this. So for instance, Innis is talking about how the development of paper sort of led to the ability to have a wider readership, just because paper was more cheap than parchment, and so, which was very expensive until the 13th century, as Innis talks about in there. So something like that, which is almost maybe, you could maybe assume that, but it's something to be reminded about the workings of these various media. He also talks about, the development of the paper industry and how it developed first in Italy in the 13th century, generally throughout Europe in the 14th century, not until the 15th century in Germany. So talking about the sort of staggering development of this sort of industry.
And the conditions of labor involved. There's a social history in this work as well.
That's right.
It's very impressive.
Which I think, again, you address in the introduction, and you point out that this is an angle that's often missing from other aspects of the communications work. So it is another interesting element, and another reason that this is worth looking at and seeing these other sides of Innis that don't come out so frequently in some of the other communications work.
Earlier I mentioned Jim Carey, who's the dean, but you know about him for the work he does in this organization. He had told me, and I think he told Paul and Bill the same thing, that he thought he did with his first article. There was an Antioch review on Innis and McLuhan. It was both it was a service to Innis, but also a disservice, because it simplified what people thought about Innis going forward, and they refused to deal with the complexities. Otherwise, they just took that simple cartoon outline and put the pieces in and let it go. And he was trying, in fact, before he died, he was working on a book comparing the two and trying to go back to the original article and basically make it more complex and richer and really talk about really what should be going on when you look at those two scholars.
Just a couple other things, like the development of cursive handwriting, he says, is introduced at the end of the 11th century. Detail that if I knew it before, I'd forgotten. That's kind of interesting. Also, I know McLuhan in the Gutenberg Galaxy talks about how the scriptures were suddenly changed, because here they all were in one place, after print. But I'm not sure McLuhan ever tells us when the first edition of the scriptures were published. Does anyone have that date at hand?
Even other than the Bible of Gutenberg.
The first edition of the entire scriptures in one volume. I guess that would be the Gutenberg.
Yes, it was. King James.
But what was the year?
1444.
55, 54.
52.
It varies.
It took 3 years to make.
Yeah.
I must have
I
something
get different
wrong, because I got 1534 here.
No.
There's something wrong.
Somewhere in the 1450.
It's 1452.
Okay.
3, 4, 5, almost dates.
Forget that. There must be something different that's going on.
Wasn't it the
there.
indulgences that were printed in 1453 that preceded the Bible? That was some jokes.
It's trial run. Yes,
The
it was.
indulgences actually preceded the publication of the scriptures.
Yes.
First thing we have to produce is the calendar.
What's next for a semester?
Well, actually, those were sort of the... I'm actually just looking at the time, and I'm wondering if maybe we should open it up to people to ask questions, because we're sort of running out
Comments,
of time.
questions.